So talking about responding really well to a crisis, let's kind of flip that on its head and look at an example of someone who, well, didn't quite respond quite well to a crisis. Now, I know not all of our audience are in Australia. We have a bit of an international audience. We are an international podcast. I'm here in the Dominican Republic and Dr. Rod is in Australia. But still, as an Australian, I'm still quite connected to what's happening in Australia. And if you're an Australian, you would know the OPTUS data breach. You would have heard that OPTUS was hacked and a whole bunch of personal information was stolen. And there was a big uproar about what's going on there, and it's still unfolding as we speak. They're still trying to figure things out, and I'll hand over to Dr. Rod to talk about details. But the CEO, I'm going to look down for her name, Kelly Bayer Rosmarin. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. She got on and did a presentation as CEO talking about their response to the breach, and it was really interesting, her response. And once again, the link is down below if you want to watch it. It's really interesting. She spent the whole time trying to spin this situation rather than just going straight out and going, this is what's wrong. Like Dr. Rod said, this is what's wrong. This is what our response are. This is the facts. This is what our response is. So Dr. Rod, maybe you can share a little bit more of an insight into that situation and the actual response by the leadership there.
Well, I would have to say I find the whole episode quite interesting because, as many people will know, I'm a director. I'm on a number of boards of charities, and I'm on your board as well, Craig, which is in your private company. So I'm well aware of the kinds of things we face as directors of companies. And I've been fascinated by the whole thing. First, because it wasn't the CEO who fronted the public initially. That was delegated. That's a big mistake.
Was it really? Wow.
Yeah. The first interviews on radio and television were actually by people below that CEO level. They were so-called C-suite officers, but the CEO wasn't the first to address the public.
Before you go on any further, why do you think that was done? Why do you think that leadership decision was made?
Look, I don't know for sure because I had no idea what was going on in the CEO's head at all. But I think all I can say is it was unwise because it became clear very, very quickly that there could have been as many as 10 million customers of OPTUS whose personal data was compromised. And we're talking here passports, driver's license, the kinds of things that are used commonly for identification purposes.
Yep.
Now, it's actually turned out to be far less than that, and I might explore some of the reasons shortly. It might only be 10,000 people. But so firstly, I think the first mistake was it was clearly a disaster when up to 10 million customers' details could have been compromised. Now, that means the CEO has to be the public face of the organisation. If not the CEO, then the chair of the board. Now, that is complicated as well because OPTUS is owned by Singtel, a Singaporean company.
Yep.
And I want to address this issue because there are cultural issues as well. So when the CEO did address the public, she, it appears, deliberately misinformed us. So she presented this as a very sophisticated hack when in fact it was something that an amateur probably did. It was probably someone who was quite amateurish who did it. And what it did was it exposed the vulnerabilities of telcos in particular to these data breaches. Now, interestingly enough, OPTUS and the other telcos in Australia opposed government proposals to impose much higher standards by legislation or by regulation just a year or 18 months previously. So, and they did it because it was going to cost them So they were looking at minimizing their costs. Therefore, they said, no, we don't want to be part of the new regime. And of course, we've seen that enabled them to maintain quite slack protocols, which, as we've seen, ended up leading to what appears to be a data breach by someone who's no more than an amateur.
And
so that's
goes
the
back.
second issue.
That goes back to what we were previously saying is, yeah, sometimes the right thing will cost you, and we need to,
absolutely.
it
could have been done, and maybe this could have been avoided. The next thing, of course, was that Optus treated its customers as if they didn't really matter. So the communication from Optus to customers was lacking, seriously lacking. And it really wasn't until, shock jocks and the government got involved that Optus started providing significant information and fixes to customers. In fact, lots of other telcos and financial institutions and so on started sending text messages and emails to their customers telling them how they could deal with the issues that arose through this breach. I'm not an Optus customer, but I got emails from my bank, the two banks that I'm involved with as a director or privately. I got an email from my own telco and from several other organisations, retail organisations and so on, who said, this has happened, this is what we're advising. So that was another misstep. And then finally, and I think this is actually the crux of the whole issue, no one's really picked this up in any of the commentary that I'm aware of, but I think it's highly significant that Optus is actually owned by Singtel. Now, if anybody has studied management in any detail, you will know that national cultures matter.
Yeah.
Now, the ownership of Optus is with a Singaporean company, that is with an Asian country. And we know that the national culture in Asian countries protects one's face.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. All right. Now, when we were talking about Try Guys, we were saying they did the right thing because they're part of, if you like, Western culture, which prizes transparency. When we're dealing with Asian cultures, though, we know that the idea of saving face is very, very powerful. It's a very powerful value. And I suspect that when we start looking into this, in the cold, hard light of day after all the crisis has passed over, I think one of the things we will discover is that the CEO herself wasn't necessarily free to do all of the things we might expect because of that ownership.
Yeah.
There's a significant cultural difference. And I think this cultural factor has come into play. As I said, that hasn't been mentioned anywhere as far as I know in the media. But I teach management. I teach my students about this every year. And we actually have a look at the empirical evidence of how national cultures affect the way we manage.
Yeah.
So I do, to some extent, have sympathy for the Optus organisation because I think to some extent their hands were tied, although I also think there was a lack of wisdom on the part of Singtel not to realise that Optus is actually an Australian operation.
Yeah.
And that they really needed to make some concessions, I think, to the different culture. But, whenever we're in business, whenever we're operating across national borders, we must be sensitive to cultures as well. So the whole thing, it was a disaster, which created more disasters because it was disastrously managed.
Yeah, that's really a good point of it created a disaster because it was disastrously managed.
Absolutely.
But I think
I've walked past a few Optus retail stores. I can tell you what, there's nobody in them.
Yeah, no.
So this has done enormous damage to the reputation of Optus. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah, to bring it back to what we as leaders, as everyday leaders can learn from this is one key thing you were talking about is understanding we spoke about knowing what our values are, making sure we know the values of that covering that we're under. In the church world, we're always talking about a spiritual covering, but we need to understand that's relevant in the business world as well. We are sitting under a spiritual covering from the people that are above us, and we just need to make sure, what are their values? What are where do those values? Now, I'm not saying obviously we as Christians have a specific set of values that not everyone carries, but there's still some more, let's call them generic values, that we still expect the organization that we're working for or maybe partnered with or whatever. We still need to make sure that our general values are aligned and understand that when it does come to a moment of crisis, well, what pressure are we going to be under to respond in a certain way that is not aligned with our values? And we need to make a decision. Are we going to bow to our bosses or whoever it is that we're under, or are we going to stand up for our values and do things our way? Now, that doesn't mean that you necessarily have to become rebellious, but you may be forced in a boardroom to stand up for a boardroom full of people that are wanting to go one way, and you standing up for your values, as actually Dr. Rod has shared a number of times before. So make sure you, when there's a disaster, take ownership. I think that's it. Like, don't make a spin about it. That's kind of like the main thing that happened with this OPTUS thing is it was just this spin around things, and it was all to save face. So own up to it. Own up to it. Stand up to it, and make your decision. Stand up, own it, and let people know what the response is going to be. Let people know what the move forward is, because that's what people are looking for. People don't care if you make a mistake. They just want to know that you've owned up to it and you have a plan forward. That's, I suppose, what most people are looking for. So, talking about people spinning things. You've just been watching an excerpt from our leadership podcast. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up. And hey, put a comment below. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this video. And if you'd like to watch the full episode, please check out our channel. And while you're there, we'd be honored if you subscribed.